30 years of loyalty. One smile from her, and it was all gone. I was still holding the folder from our record-breaking contract when I realized the meeting wasn't a celebration. The owner, Charles DeWitt, hadn't even shown. Just his daughter, Savannah, in a chair she hadn't earned and heels too loud for a room this quiet. Her cousin Derek stood in the corner pretending not to look proud of himself. The champagne on the side table was untouched. Bad sign. My name is Marshall Wynn, 57 years old, Vice President of Logistics at Caldwell and Rowe Industrial Solutions, or at least I was up until 20 minutes ago. I'd spent 3 decades building this company's spine, every distribution route, every supplier negotiation, every crisis diverted by a spreadsheet and a phone call at 2 a.m. That was me. I'd taken them from a third-tier Rust Belt manufacturer to a global contract supplier. But today, none of that mattered. Savannah leaned back in her chair like she owned the oxygen in the room. "You're yesterday, Marshall," she said with a little purr in her voice, like she was doing me a favor. "We need to future-proof the company. You understand." I didn't reply. I just looked at her the way I might look at a crane that had dropped its load casually, a bit curious, but ultimately unsurprised. She smiled wider, clearly mistaking silence for submission. "Derek will be stepping in as VP of Logistics. He has fresh eyes, a new vision. We're restructuring to be more agile." Derek adjusted his blazer sleeve like that somehow made him more competent. He was 30 if that, straight out of business school, full of ideas he hadn't tested. I'd seen his type 100 times: talk first, learn later, burn everything in between. I handed her the contract folder. It was still warm from my hands, still humming with the value of a 5-year supply deal I'd locked down less than 6 hours ago. "You might want to actually read that," I said. "It's worth more than the last 3 years of revenue combined." She took it without looking down. "We'll review it internally." I stood, adjusted my cuff, straightened my spine. My body moved on its own reflexes developed from years of knowing when a meeting was already over. The kind of professionalism that stays with you even when the room smells like betrayal. "You'll be taken care of," Savannah added. "Severance, transition package, glowing references. It's not personal." Of course it wasn't personal. It was clinical. Strategic, like amputating a limb to feel lighter on the scale. I nodded, shook Derek's hand, flimsy grip, no calluses, and walked out of the boardroom as the glass door clicked shut behind me. The hallway was quiet. Late afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting gold onto the carpet I helped choose during the last renovation. A junior associate passed me in the corridor, eyebrows raised like he'd seen a ghost. I smiled. In the elevator, I pressed lobby and stared at my reflection in the chrome. Gray hair at the temples, still sharp, still breathing, still in control. Outside, traffic hummed along East Market Street. I got into my car, turned the key, and let the engine idle for a moment. I didn't call anyone, didn't curse, didn't even clench the wheel. I just sat with the moment, let it settle like steel cooling in the mold. They thought they'd buried me. What they'd done, what she had done, was remove the weight that had kept me from moving freely. I knew every weak point in that company, every over-leveraged vendor, every vendor that only stayed loyal because of my personal relationships, every optimization model that was 2 layers away from collapse without someone who actually understood how trucks move in snow at 3 a.m. through the Ohio Valley. Savannah thought she was playing chess. She'd just kicked her queen off the board and replaced it with a pawn wearing cologne and buzzwords. She'd just promoted a fire into the engine room. She just didn't know it yet. I didn't burn the building down. I just removed the fire exits. The first full day after they let me go, I sat in my home office with the blinds half closed, watching the digital tide roll in. Emails from vendors, a few polite check-ins from colleagues who weren't sure if they were allowed to talk to me anymore. And 2 messages from my replacement. Derek, asking if I could forward whatever files might help ease the transition. I didn't answer. If the man meant what he said in the boardroom about fresh vision and agile systems, then he didn't need my old blueprints. Caldwell, IB Day. Rowe was never built for flash. It was a machine of patience. I started in the warehouse in '92, back when invoices were still carbon paper and forklifts sputtered like lawnmowers. I was 24, broke and hungry. I worked 12-hour shifts, learned routing by watching dispatchers scribble truck schedules on the back of cigarette packs, and spent weekends teaching myself supply chain theory from borrowed textbooks. By '97, I was running warehouse ops. By 2003, I had a corner office. Logistics VP by 2009. Just in time to steer us through the recession without a single missed delivery. My systems weren't sexy. They were functional, tested, and ugly enough to survive economic winters. Everything had a redundancy. Every vendor had a backup. I didn't build a company, I built a system. Derek didn't understand systems. 1 week after Savannah gave him my chair, I started getting texts from the old crew. A senior driver flagged me about a truckload of components rerouted to the wrong plant. 180 kelvins lost before noon. One of the inventory specialists sent a photo of Derek's new inventory app interface with a caption, "You need a PhD to find a screwdriver now." 3 days later, a vendor I'd worked with for 19 years called to tell me their payment was 2 weeks late. I hadn't even known Derek had messed with accounts payable. Turns out he'd automated invoice approvals and the system was duplicating payments on some contracts and withholding them on others. Clients started calling too quietly, cautiously trying to get my opinion on whether the new leadership was temporary. I stayed polite, non-committal, but I listened. Derek didn't. He brushed off the veterans like they were artifacts in a dusty museum, told procurement that AI would streamline everything within the quarter. He used words like disruption and pivot and lean, words I'd heard from every green suit that ever tried to cut corners around hard-earned wisdom, the kind of words you use when you're trying to impress investors, not actually move steel across the country in a snowstorm. Savannah didn't blink. She liked Derek's energy, liked that he called her savvy in meetings and pitched things with bullet points and pastel graphs. When the first major client emailed to express concern, she brushed it off as resistance to change. They weren't resisting change. They were watching the ship take on water and wondering who was supposed to be steering. Then came the call. Hal Wexler, VP of Operations at Baymark Materials, our largest client. I'd closed their contract personally 8 years ago and protected it like a crown jewel. Hal didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Marshall," he said. "Off the record, we've had 4 delays in 2 weeks and 3 separate invoices for the same order. What the hell's going on over there?" I told him I couldn't speak to internal operations anymore. Not officially. Not even unofficially. He paused. "If you were still there, this wouldn't be happening." I didn't argue. That was the closest thing to a compliment Hal ever gave. He asked if I'd consider consulting. Quietly. Just to fix what Derek was breaking. I told him I needed to think about it. That was true. But what I didn't tell him was that I'd already begun preparing. That night, after the house was quiet and my wife had gone to bed, I walked into the garage. Same concrete floor I'd patched myself. Same heavy shelves I built 20 years ago when I still thought this job might carry me to retirement. I reached for the top corner, moved aside an old tarp, and pulled down a black storage case. Inside were 3 thick binders, each locked shut with a simple clip. Each one labeled by hand. Crisis protocols. Supplier influence matrix. System overrides. I brushed off a layer of dust and carried them inside. Pages of maps, contract notes, undocumented workarounds, private vendor contact chains, things nobody else knew existed. Not fire, just the air supply. And Savannah had no idea she'd already lit the fuse. Every system has a valve. Derek forgot I designed the plumbing. The beauty of sabotage is that it doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't come with fireworks or explosions. If you've done your work right, it looks like coincidence. Just a little extra friction here, a missed handshake there, and when you're the one who built the entire structure from the ground up, you don't need to swing a sledgehammer. You just close the right valve and let the pressure do the rest. The first call I made was to Lena Ramirez, Regional Transport Lead for R&R Logistics. We'd shared 10 Thanksgivings over phone calls to reroute hauls through blizzards, hurricanes, and union strikes. She owed me more favors than she could count, and I'd never once called one in. "Lena," I said, "you got a minute?" She did, and when I asked if her trucks could delay pickups from Caldwell and Rose Eastern Hub by 2 days without explanation, without pushing it too far, she didn't even ask why. "You got it," she said. I made similar calls for the rest of the week. Not many. Just enough. Just the ones that mattered. A temperature-sensitive shipment, redirected to a warehouse I knew had cooling issues. A polymer order rerouted through a vendor that took its time with fulfillment if you didn't grease the right palms, which Derek didn't know existed. None of it illegal. None of it traceable. All of it quietly effective. 3 days later, I got my first message from inside the walls. It was Cheryl in accounts. She used to bring donuts every Friday, glazed if it was payday, powdered if it wasn't. She texted me from a burner app. "We just got a call from Trispan threatening to cancel. They say they were charged double for a shipment that hasn't arrived." Derek told Savannah it was legacy billing code errors. It wasn't. It's the new system. It's breaking. By Friday, 6 more messages came in. A packaging supplier emailed me directly, asking if I was still consulting. I wasn't. Not officially. Not yet. Meanwhile, Savannah was busy giving interviews to trade blogs about redefining logistics leadership and eliminating institutional bottlenecks. Derek posted a photo of himself on LinkedIn in front of the company's loading dock with the caption, "New era, new energy." The comment section was polite. Internally, they were hemorrhaging. I waited until the following Tuesday before setting a meeting with Granite Axis, our once bitter rival. They'd always been the loud ones at conferences, promising more than they could deliver. Their COO, Brent Tuller, had been publicly humiliated by Savannah 5 years ago when she dismissed their pitch in front of the room, called them yesterday's middlemen. I called his office and got a reply within an hour. We met at a steakhouse in Cleveland, dark wood walls, thick napkins, the kind of place you go to, write down real numbers on real paper. He was already at the booth when I walked in, drink in hand. "Marshall," he said, rising to shake my hand. I wondered how long it would take. "I'm not here to settle old scores," I said. "I'm here to offer a shortcut." He raised an eyebrow. "I know where the holes are, where the panic will hit next. I can't give you proprietary documents, but I can point you where to look and where not to bother." He didn't say yes right away. He didn't have to. The silence meant terms were being processed. When I got home, I found a message waiting on my personal phone. It was from Ella Greaves, a former intern who now worked in HR. "They're falling apart. Derek's blaming your old team. HR is a war zone. People are looking for exits." I leaned back in my chair and exhaled through my nose. Not satisfaction. Not yet. But close. Later that night, as I was filing notes, my phone buzzed again. A message from Savannah. No subject. Just 2 words. "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen for a moment, then turned the phone face down on the desk. No need to rush. Let her wait. Let her wonder what I knew. How far the cracks had spread. How much time she had left to fix what couldn't be fixed. She had built her empire on the assumption that the system would bend to her will, but I was the one who built it. And now it was leaking slowly, steadily on command. She wore power like perfume. I brought silence like a knife. Savannah chose a place with chandeliers made of glass leaves and a maitre d' who spoke in quiet apologies. A restaurant where everything was soft and indirect, perfect for someone trying to salvage control without admitting she'd lost it. She was already at the table when I arrived, dressed in something expensive and unthreatening. Her smile flickered like a faulty light bulb. "Marshall," she said, rising to greet me. "I'm glad you came." I nodded, took my seat, didn't bother with the menu. I already knew I wouldn't be staying long. She launched into pleasantries, trying to set a tone that didn't exist anymore. Said she appreciated my time. Said the company was adjusting to the new structure. And Derek was learning quickly. I let her talk, sipping my water while her voice did laps around the truth. She looked thinner, tighter in the jaw. The kind of wear that doesn't show up on Instagram posts or in press releases. Eventually, she got to it. We may have moved too fast, she admitted, folding her napkin twice like it was a negotiation tactic. You were always the backbone, Mike. We just needed fresh eyes. I smiled, politely. Of course. I mean, you were invaluable. You still are. That's why I asked to meet. Her tone shifted, softened. There's a place for you. Maybe not full-time, but as an advisor. Consultant. We'd compensate well. I leaned back slightly, hands resting in my lap. No sudden moves. Savannah, I admire your ambition. I always have. You've got vision. But let me show you something. I reached into my bag and laid a slim binder on the white linen. Her eyes hesitated before looking down. This is a timeline, I said, flipping it open. Of failures, not rumors, not gossip. Hard timestamps. Page 1, Baymark's delayed order. Page 2, the missed payment to Trispan. Page 3, an emergency restock that triggered a penalty clause. Each page detailed who was responsible, when it happened, and what it cost. She glanced up. Her smile was gone. This was week 1, I continued. Here's week 2. The next section listed duplicated invoices, vendor freezes, and client complaints. At the bottom, I'd included verbatim messages from clients. Who is running ops over there? Marshall. Would never have let this happen. We're reviewing the contract. Savannah didn't say anything. Her fingers tapped lightly on the table, a quiet Morse code of anxiety. And this, I said, turning the final page, is an internal email from Derek to procurement, instructing them to bypass manual reviews. Subject line, speed is greater than precision. You weren't supposed to see that, but people talk when they're scared. She froze. Her hand dropped to her lap. I didn't come here to gloat, I said. You asked me to listen. So I did. I listened to the market, the vendors, your employees, your clients, and I wrote it all down. She looked up at me like a swimmer, realizing the shore was further than she thought. We can fix this, she said, voice barely above a whisper. With your help. I took a breath, not a deep one, just enough to steady the next blow. I'm not here for a seat at the table, Savannah. I came to pull the tablecloth. She asked if I'd seen the news. I said, I wrote it. The day it all detonated started like any other quiet coffee. Inbox zeroed out. Binder on the desk in front of me. Pages neatly aligned. I'd filed the report to the board anonymously, though anyone who read it closely wouldn't need a signature to know where it came from. 79 pages of data. Timelines, red flags, and names. Everything Derek had touched since taking my chair. Everything Savannah had ignored or covered. Each mistake documented like exhibits in a courtroom. I didn't stop at the board. I CC'd FINRA, OSHA, and a quiet contact at the SEC, a former logistics officer I'd once pulled out of a jam when she needed shipment records during an antitrust probe. No theatrics, just the truth in chronological order. 2 days later, the regulators arrived. Not with sirens, just suits and clipboards and firm voices requesting files. The same day, Granite Axis made their move, announcing they'd secured contracts with 4 of Caldwell and Rowe's top-tier clients. The press release didn't mention my name, but their wording, thanks to key industry insights and timing, was deliberate. Savannah tried to play calm, issued a bland internal memo about routine audits and internal transitions. But the walls were already cracking. Vendors froze shipments. Payment processors flagged delays. One client filed breach of contract. Then 2 more followed. I heard whispers that the board called an emergency session. Derek was nowhere to be found for 3 days, allegedly sick. But I knew the smell of retreat when I caught it. By the end of the week, Derek was fired. Not gently, not with ceremony. Fired the way you remove a ticking device from a foundation, quick, surgical, necessary. Word was he cleaned out his desk at 10 p.m. to avoid the stairs. No LinkedIn farewell post. Just gone. Savannah's name vanished from the leadership roster 2 days later. Administrative suspension pending investigation. HR scrubbed her biography quietly, like it had never been there. No public announcement. Just a vacant corner office with the lights off and the blinds drawn tight. A letter came the following Monday. Official stationery. The board, now fully awake, invited me to return not as an employee, but as an independent trustee to oversee company restructuring. Their language was careful, respectful. They needed stability. They needed someone who knew the bones of the house. I accepted, but not before I made one condition clear. Savannah never returns. Not in shadow, not in silence, not in any advisory capacity. Gone, permanently. They agreed. When I walked back into the building, no one cheered. No parade. Just silent nods from people who'd seen the storm and were grateful someone had brought sandbags. The air smelled like antiseptic and nervous relief. The walls, once covered with motivational posters and open-concept fantasies, now bore nothing but silence and the occasional flicker of a nameplate removed. In the first trustee meeting, I reviewed 3 divisions, outlined restructuring protocols, and authorized a third-party audit of all vendor contracts. By lunch, I'd already rewritten 2 lines of command, reinstated the failsafes Derek had erased. I was calm, precise, unapologetic. At 3:40 p.m., my assistant knocked lightly and handed me a handwritten envelope from Savannah. Inside, a single sentence. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. I turned it over once, twice, then dropped it into the shredder. She said I was yesterday, but I buried her in tomorrow.